hope this is working. Is it working? Good. And thank you very much, Matthew, for the introduction. I had hoped you might go on for about 40 minutes. But I see now that the moment of truth has arrived and I have to start talking. However, I can avoid that for a moment by doing some housekeeping, which I've been instructed to do. You'll understand, I'm obedient. And I need to point out that in the Lancaster room, from 2:50 this afternoon until 4:50 this afternoon, there is the Policy and Politics Most Cited Papers panel, which I am assured will enable anyone who wants to publish in any journal to have instant success if they listen to the words of wisdom from the authors of the most cited papers in the history of policy and politics, nay, the world, the universe. So don't miss that. Did I do that all right? Was that okay? Okay, good. Now, thank you also to David and Sarah for inviting me. I don't think I have the Bristol credentials that some of your other plenary speakers have had. So I'm doubly delighted to be invited as a kind of outsider. I have been to Bristol before, but that's about it. And it was a long time ago. However, you probably didn't realise when you invited me that it would coincide so exactly with my return to the United Kingdom after 16 years. My stuff was delivered to an apartment in Brighton last Friday, and if I have bits of cardboard still stuck to me, that is the reason why. So this is like a double homecoming, domestic and academic, and I'm still a little bit disoriented by it all. As was the case with Rod's presentation this morning, there is a paper, a substantial paper, full of the usual academic paraphernalia, and if any of you wish to access that, just send me an email. I don't think it's on a website anywhere yet, but I'll be happy to send you a copy. So now, we get to the beginning. I thought it was an appropriate topic for this conference, for obvious reasons. I would stress that this is public management reform in UK central government. I'll say very little about local government, which I've had a number of discussions with people who actually know about local government, unlike me, and they suggest to me that things are rather different there, and I'm happy to accept their expert judgment. So this is just about central government reforms. And there are a number of reasons why I think this is a reasonably important topic, not least that we've had so many of these reforms, and we continue to have a very high volume of structure and process type reforms in central government. Now, if I begin with what is relatively the good news, something slightly funny has gone, it's cutting off the top of my slides. Does anybody, it's probably not desperately important, but if anybody knows how to fix that. The top of the slide says the UK as a world leader in public management reform. And some evidence for that is simply the volume of reform that we've had, almost unceasing. Every now and then you get 2 or 3 years without something big, but basically fairly unceasing large-scale reforms, 1970 to 2012. A lot of people talk about the New Zealand catharsis of 1984 to 1993 as the most pure and radical piece of public management reform in recent history. I would argue that the British record is of even more radical reform, because the British intensity of reform may not have been quite equal to that spike in New Zealand, but it's gone on for much, much longer. New Zealand has calmed down after 1993, and they hadn't done much at all before 1984, whereas in the UK it has gone on and on and on. UK examples, in consequence perhaps, are very frequently cited in the international literature. I'm not talking about the specifically domestic literature here. Both the practitioner literature and the academic literature. The Cabinet Office and DFID and its predecessors have been active internationally for many years in actively promoting, marketing, selling UK management ideas and practices. And in my wanderings around the world, I've several times bumped into Cabinet Office people who are frankly selling one or other aspect of the British model. And the international organizations which have been centrally engaged in developing the kind of international practitioner thinking and rhetoric on public management reform have been organizations which have been quite heavily populated by Brits or quite heavily influenced by British ideas. So in all those respects, the UK has been a leader and a major player globally in public management reform. I have in the paper a citation of Stephen Dorrell, who was then a junior Treasury Minister, making a speech in 1993 during the Major administration, where he said very directly the marketising reforms of Thatcher and Major are a model which the whole of the rest of the world is now following, and it's not surprising because they work. This is a somewhat megalomaniac vision of the role of the UK, but not entirely without echoes overseas. So that's the good news. We can award ourselves a gold medal for public management reform. Now let's turn to the slightly less good news. If we ask some questions about this reform, I would argue that we find a number of slightly curious or disturbing features. First of all, there's remarkably little reliable and warranted knowledge of the actual outcomes of any of this reform. That's not to say that there aren't endless stories and anecdotes, particularly in the practitioner world, but also in the academic world, about what's been successful and what's not. But in terms of the kind of stuff that orthodox social scientists, if such creatures still exist, would regard as reasonably firm evidence, there is practically none. And I am not standing out as a radical commentator here. I believe in saying that I am fairly much mainstream in the academic world. I think Rod Rhodes and Christopher Hood, who was here this morning, would both probably say much the same thing, and so would a number of other people. Secondly, which is in a way more disturbing than the first point, there's very little sign that the governments who have carried out these reforms have themselves been in the least bit interested in discovering the consequences. I could come back to that, if you like, but I mean, what Christopher Hood and Ruth Dixon have recently more or less completed a massive statistical exercise on the Thatcher and Major efficiency reforms of the 1980s and early 1990s, and the broad conclusion they've come to is that there was no measurable efficiency gain. Yes, of course, you know, you can look at individual Rayner scrutinies or whatever, and you can find quite significant gains and little bits of savings. But when you look at the big picture of departmental running costs and departmental outputs, insofar as there's any official data by which you can measure those things, they do not show a significant efficiency gain. There's a little bit of bumping up and down over time, but overall, no. And again, I think Christopher would say that one of the kind of most curious aspects of this is that it's he and Ruth Dixon who've been left researching this in 2010, 2011, 2012, because the governments themselves, neither the ministers nor senior civil servants, have shown any interest in putting this data together before. They've shown no interest in checking whether the programs they themselves have instigated have actually resulted in the things that they said they would result in. That's not to say that nothing has been learned. I do want to emphasize that I think in terms of the process of reform, obviously so many senior officials have been involved in it that many of them will have picked up all sorts of useful practitioner wisdom about how you do this stuff. But that's very different from having knowledge of what the final outcomes and effects are, whether efficiency, in terms of a ratio between inputs and outputs, or the effectiveness of public services, or the ultimate perceived quality as far as the citizens using those services. Have any of those things changed as a result of the reforms? That's a different kind of knowledge, and that seems to be much more thin on the ground. What I'd like to do very, very quickly, just to fill in the picture a little bit, give you a little bit more evidence, is to look at a sample or a selection of some of the big reform white papers over the 40-year period, and to ask about their content, their continuities and the discontinuities in them. And these are the ones that I've chosen. The Heath government 1970 reorganisation, the Thatcher 1981 efficiency in government, John Major's Citizens' Charter, Blair's modernising government, which would have been a little bit earlier if he hadn't had problems with the relevant minister, and the more recent Coalition Open Public Services white paper, which I'm sure you will all be much more familiar with than I. All these they're chosen deliberately because they're broad scope public management reform programs. They're not confined to one sector, so obviously there have been lots more reform white papers than that. Thatcher's 1989 Working for Patients reform of the National Health Service was a huge reform, but it was a sectoral reform. These are horizontal reforms. They all come reasonably early in the life of the government, so you could say that this is before these governments have been blown too badly off course, that perhaps you could argue that they embody some of the fresh ideas that these governments have brought into government and hope to implement. Now, changes and continuities, looking across these 5 white papers. First of all, a very obvious, perhaps slightly superficial change is that the white papers have got much longer and they're no longer white. They become much glossier. They're written in a different way now. They're written in a kind of populist jargon. The first two, the dividing line there, I think, comes between the 1970-1981 on the one hand and John Major's Citizens' Charter. Somewhere in the 1980s, the nature of these white papers changed. Before that, they were essentially the government deigning to tell the rest of us how they were going to put their own house in order. It was like, we're going to do this. We, being the authority on the machinery of government, indeed it was then called the machinery of government, and we're going to adjust the machinery in this way in order to achieve these improvements. And the first two are focused very much on ministries. So the reorganisation of central government was about central government. It was about central policy-making machinery and big ministries. The 1981 thing was about efficiencies and saving money and cutting out waste by applying business-like techniques primarily in ministries. The later ones have broadened their scope to include the whole of the public sector, and by the 2011 white paper, beyond the public sector. You can think of this as a shift to governance if you want to be fancy about it, but certainly many more actors are being brought in. I mean, the 1999 Blair white paper very much included local authorities, partners in the non-profit and for-profit sectors. It covered a much wider range than the earlier paper. So that's something of a change. The field of activity or the scope of ideas about public management reform seems to have enlarged very considerably. Another change is that, connected with this sort of tone of voice thing, is that the citizen was barely present in the first two white papers. It was an addressee but played no other part in them. In the first two, government was just saying what it was going to do with its own stuff. Of course, by the time you get to the 2011 white paper, the citizen is smattered all over it, or a notional citizen, perhaps I should say, is smattered all over it. And it's the same citizen who is much mentioned in the Blair 1999 white paper, Modernising Government. It is the actively choosing consumer-style citizen. I think John Clark and Janet Newman have each written very persuasively and given some fine grain to this discussion of how this image of the citizen has been gradually, or sometimes rather rapidly, transformed into the consumer citizen, who still seems to be the most popular kind of citizen with the coalition government, as he or she was with the Blair and Brown administrations. Now for the continuity. Now the continuity is kind of rather striking when you see it, but it's not necessarily obvious. It's kind of one of those things that suddenly strikes you. Now these are documents about management, primarily. Policy making, but mainly about management. They all share, right over the 40-year period, three characteristics, and all three are the absence of something. First of all, none of them documents the need for reform. They provide virtually no evidence on that. The nearest you come to evidence is the mention of a stereotype, usually. We must reduce bureaucracy. We must make the administration more responsive to citizens. In the latest one, the accusation that the public sector has not merely ignored, but in some ways actively amplified inequalities between services to different groups of citizens in different areas, etc., etc. No evidence is offered for this whatsoever in any of these papers. It may be true, I'm not saying it's untrue, I'm just saying that these white papers are evidently not the vehicle for persuading us by offering us any evidence. Secondly, none of them has any targets. Now, these are management documents, they're white papers, but they're about management. You might say, in the era of performance management, that you would expect them to have some targets. They don't. The nearest thing to targets occur in the 1991 Citizens' Charter, where there are some things which, if you are, I think, reasonably generous with your use of language, you could say that they are quasi-targets, that we will have certain things in place within a number of years. And third, and perhaps most important or most surprising of all, none of them are costed. There are no costings in any way. Some of these reforms, absolutely gigantic. We know how expensive reorganisation can be in all sorts of ways. The transactional costs and sometimes the direct costs of reform are very considerable. If you don't believe me, go and read some of the National Audit Office reports on some recent central government reorganisations. That information is just not there. So, do they, in the absence of costs or targets, do they have any built-in method of checking or evaluation? Answer, no. In none of them, except, again, the Citizens' Charter, which, of course, many of us, mea culpa, laughed at the time. You remember the Steve Bell cartoons of John Major wearing Superman underpants and all that, and a lot of fun was made of the Citizens' Charter, but actually it was the only one of these reforms where there was a staged programme of assessment and reassessment with a degree of independence in that, and reporting to Parliament on how so there were 1, 2, 3, I think at least 3 sort of evaluations going out 2 years, 5 years of what was happening. So this is a bit strange. This is a strange kind of reform you're dealing with. If you go into other areas away from public management, you would expect white papers to have some evidence, to have some costings, and to have some targets, but we don't get that. We don't get that in public management reform. But what we do get is a lot of promises. They're not short on promises. These are just the kind of kernel of these papers. 1970, more coordinated strategic approach. 1981, modern business techniques will eliminate waste and lower public spending, etc., etc. You can see them up there. So, I've already said we don't have much evidence about what happened, but can we get any handle at all on whether these promises were met? I would say a little bit, but it's often very difficult. 1970, more coordinated and strategic approach to policy making. If you think about the last year of the Heath administration and its fall, I think you would be stretching a point to describe that as coordinated and strategic. And indeed, some of the instruments and processes which Heath introduced were subsequently ditched. The rational policy making models of program analysis and review, the central policy review staff, the giant departments. Giant departments didn't last long. Central policy review staff lasted into the Thatcher era, but it was a very much weakened animal, and so on. Better evidence base, who knows? Interesting that evidence-based policy making is not actually the flavour of 2012, it was the flavour of 1970, of October 1970, and it comes back every now and then ever since. 1981, modern business techniques will eliminate waste and lower public spending. Well, there is no doubt that in some specific instances they increased efficiency and lowered costs. However, the work I've already referred to by Hood and Dixon and other work by Dunleavy and earlier work also by Christopher Hood with Andrew Dunsire seems to indicate that, number one, public expenditure as a percentage of GDP certainly didn't go down during the Thatcher era. It was more or less exactly the same at the end as it was at the beginning. And secondly, it now seems that while there may have been local efficiency gains, there was no overall systemic efficiency gain across central government. So there's a bit of a question mark against that promise. 1991, I'm amazed to find myself standing here as a kind of apologist for the Citizens' Charter, because again, this is the only one where you can say, well, yes, actually this did happen. The Citizens' Charter may well not have been the only thing pushing it to happen, but I was somewhat involved in research around that at the time, and yes, it was easy to make fun of it, but there was some kind of a shift during that decade, during the 90s, and having targets and giving more information became, if not universal, at least the norm and far more widespread than it had been 10 years earlier. So maybe on that one. 1999, joined up government, evidence-based policy-making partnerships, e-government enhanced. It was a bit of a potpourri. As for joined up government, it's hard to read the endless and ever more detailed accounts of the relationship between the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Prime Minister as a sterling example of joined up government. And it's hard to read the various accounts which have emerged of the so-called SOFA-based policy making as indicative of very heavily evidence-linked policy making. But certainly some interesting documentation came out. I mean, the Cabinet Office produced some very neat, nice guides to how to do it. Whether they actually did it, very hard to say. 2011, obviously, much too soon to make a judgment about that. Quite interesting in the way in which some of the terms, the meaning of some of the terms, seemed to shift in that white paper. So equality seemed to take on a new kind of meaning, and plurality seemed to take on a new kind of meaning competition and contracting out, but we won't go into that. As for sort of outcomes, we just don't know yet. So the obvious question is why, if I'm even halfway right about this, that we've had a generation of massive change, undoubtedly costly in time and effort and to some extent in money, and all this was done without any very clear targets, without any costings, and without any follow-through to check. That's quite surprising. How could that be? Why would that be? Well, let's look at some reasons why there was so little hard evidence. I'd say there's two sort of big, obvious groups of reasons. One, and this is not the fault of Blair or Thatcher or Heath or anybody else, it's just damn difficult to design and implement monitoring evaluation for big, complex reforms of this kind for a whole raft of reasons which many people have written about, including myself. The reforms themselves don't stand still. You don't take a model and implement it. What happens is that the model changes in the process of implementation. The process of implementation usually takes at least a year or two, and the context also changes as you're going through the process, so that the thing that eventually gets implemented is not exactly, and sometimes not at all, the thing that you thought you were going to implement at the beginning. It's a moving picture. Even if you do an evaluation, even if you set one up, you have to set it up theoretically. In orthodox terms, you have to set it up before you make the change, so that you've got before and after measurements, and that's often very difficult to do, both politically and even administratively. And then afterwards, even if you manage to collect some data on changes and outcomes, you usually have great difficulty attributing them to that specific reform. Or if you thought you could attribute something to, let's say, the Modernising Government programme of 1999, how on earth would you know which bit of that potpourri it was that was actually the crucial bit, or which 2 bits or which 3 bits? Because it's unlikely that the whole thing had some kind of combined positive effect. It's much more likely that some things worked and some things doesn't. This is the whole realistic evaluation tradition of Tilley and Pawson. That's the language I'm using at the moment. So there are big methodological problems. Even if academics had got huge grants to do evaluations, we would still, and we've been able to have access and to be independent, it would still have been rather difficult to do. However, the second group of reasons, coming on top of the first, is the reason I've already mentioned, that on the whole, the Whitehall elite seem to have been remarkably uninterested in doing this kind of evaluation anyway. Political interest is seldom sustained over the whole life cycle of a major reform. Even if the same government is still in power, individuals will have moved on. In some cases, evaluations are actively resisted. I was around in the late 1980s, 1990 it would have been, trying to get research grants from the ESRC to look at the impact of the Working for Patient white paper on the organisation of the NHS. And at one point, my dear colleague Steve Harrison and I were in the Department of Health, how shall I say, it was made clear to us that messages had been received that academic attention to the impacts of these reforms was not welcome. It was considered premature, and the idea was the reform should be allowed to settle down before anyone did any. Now that didn't stop some academics from doing work, but it certainly handicapped them from doing it, because the access was difficult, funding was difficult, and they were doing it all retrospectively when the reform was already half over, so to speak. And that was a huge, largest organisation, most complex organisation in Europe, barring, some people say, the Red Army, which was still in existence then. Unprecedented kind of internal market reform, which had never been tried anywhere. Crying out for some sort of evaluation, no, not necessary. We know it's right. So sometimes evaluations just not thought about, sometimes evaluations actually resisted. Even if you have them, politicians tend not to wait for them, for the results, until you move on to the next thing. I'll give you a quote from a personal correspondence from a permanent secretary who was very heavily involved in the the Major and Blair reforms. And he wrote this: governments lack a theory of and experience of embedding change coherently. So the people involved in the storylines, the people involved in the storylines are dropped and changed too quickly. The same person informed me that in his view, 2 years after the 1999 Working for Patients White Paper, the 1999 Modernising Government White Paper, basically the Prime Minister and his entourage and senior ministers were no longer interested in that agenda at all. Their public service reform ideas had moved on. I mean, us academics hadn't even started publishing on it. We were getting very excited, but up there at the summits of power, it was already something. Yes, it wasn't rejected. No, there was nothing wrong with it. It's just, it's not interesting anymore. It's history, as they say. So there are two groups of reasons. Now, why has there been so much reform then, one might ask? To some extent, this has been an international wave, and we are not alone. But I would like to argue that there is a degree of UK exceptionalism in this, for reasons that I'll briefly describe. First of all, we're in the Anglo-Saxon club of enthusiasts for managerialism. So that includes Australia and New Zealand. The US is an interesting case because they talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk at all, because they have constitutional and problems with the legislature and with all sorts of vested interests that cramp the president's style if he wants to reorganize anything. And many of the American departments are the same as they were 20 years ago. They haven't been serially reorganized. But they talk the talk. They certainly have the managerialist language, and a lot of their procedures and processes are quite managerialist. But we have to remember, and those of you who've looked at any of my work over the last 15 years will be bored with hearing me say and write this. We have to remember that the Anglo-Saxon club, of which we are a leading member, is not the whole world, and that there are many important, complex, advanced states out there who really have not been so dramatically interested in this, or they've pretended and offered a polite interest, but they've never really tried to implement anything, or they have been constitutionally, procedurally unable to implement things, even if they wanted to. Like in Germany, the slim state debate raged for about 7 or 8 years, but actually didn't do very much, because they couldn't. The federal government remained very, very stable and similar, because it would have required very difficult legislative processes to change it. So we're a member of, first of all, we're a member of a club of enthusiasts about management change. And secondly, we're probably we're the outlying member of that club. We have certain things that encourage management reform, or I should say repetitive management reform. We have those things to a greater degree than anybody else. First of all, we're law-like. We don't have a constitution that restrains prime ministers who want to make changes to the machinery of government very much at all. The actual legal procedures are extremely light and easy, and as long as you have a majority in the House of Commons, you probably don't even need that. I've told academics and civil servants from other countries that the whole of the Next Steps programme of agency creation from 1988 to late 1990s, that shifted at one point nearly 70% of the non-industrial civil service out of ministries into agencies, or out of something, including ministries, into agencies. The whole of that programme was carried through with basically no new legislation. Just 1 or 2 bits where special legislation. They can't believe it. But surely you have to have a statute when you create, a new statute when you create, the prisons agency or the driving and vehicle licensing agency. No, you don't. You don't. So it's law-like. It's a highly centralised, majoritarian system, so what the Prime Minister decides usually goes. for management reform, and it's a toothless legislature. Apologies to parliamentarians among you, but as far as management reform is concerned, it's an absolutely toothless legislature. And believe me, I've sat in the libraries in the old days, actually had libraries with copies of Hansard in, and I've gone through the very few Commons and Lords debates that there have been on management reform, and they are feeble in the extreme. Some very good points made by individual speakers, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't stop anybody for 1 minute. So my conclusion is that we have a lot of management reform because it's so easy. If you want to use it, if you're a Prime Minister, you want to use it for symbolic purposes, for a little exercise of rhetoric, to show you're in charge, to show you're doing something. Maybe there's been a crisis or a scandal, so let's reorganize. It's as easy as pie. This is the easiest country in the world to make those sorts of changes in, as far as I know. Somebody will now start to talk to me about how easy it is in Bogota or something, but as far as I know, it's probably the easiest country in the world. So, some reflections. I think behind this process, I would not assume that the motives for reform have remained absolutely constant over the 40-year period. I think there has been some shift. The way I would describe the shift is as follows, that in the late 1960s and early 1970s, we were just coming to the end of a period in which machinery of government changes were really rather dry and dusty things. They were not things for popular public debate or making big claims or anything. They were just the government adjusting its own administrative machinery. And you had a little machinery of government secretariat in the Treasury or the Civil Service Department, and occasionally you needed to make machinery changes because bits of Whitehall were obviously working very badly together. Occasionally you wanted to make changes because you had an awkward minister who needed a bigger department, the famous case of Richard Crossman, leading to the creation of the Department of Health and Social Security, because either health or social security would have been too small for a minister of his eminence at that time. Things like that. Sometime during the 80s and 90s, however, public management reform became something rather different. It became a more programmatic and a more international thing. It became like a kind of stage on which you strutted to show that you were modern and progressive and that you knew what the latest tools and processes were, or even in some cases that you had invented them. And public management reform in a number of countries, not just the UK, has now become a policy sector in its own right. People like Michael Barsley have written about this at some length. So that it would be strange for a party that thought it might be in government after an election nowadays not to have some kind of program of public management reform. There is somehow, from somewhere, we've acquired the assumption that yes, of course, well, what will you do about public management reform if you get power? Well, we will do this. That wasn't really, it certainly wasn't there in the 1950s. It was maybe Harold Wilson had a bit of it in 1964, but if you go back, that's not normally part of manifestos. Very little was usually said. To put it another way, public management reform has become both an ideology and a business, a large-scale international business with its own networks and communities that benefits considerably from this unceasing process of reform. According to the National Audit Office, for example, in the financial year 2003-2004, how much do you think this central government spent on management consultants looking at machinery of government? Answer, just over £2 billion in one financial year. National Audit Office also discovered the interesting fact that the rising and falling of expenditure on management consultants almost exactly mirrored the private sector corporate spending on management consultants. So when private sector spending went down because there was an economic recession or something, public spending went up. So the big management consultancies were able to maintain a fairly steady flow of income. It just came from public source instead of private sources sometimes. So, and people like Saint Martin, I should say, I think, and others have written about the nature of this emerging international community and its links with management consultancies, OECD, World Bank, and various other intergovernmental organizations. Can this situation that I've described, if you believe it, can it change? Well, yes, I think a number of conditions might lead to its decay or even disappearance. First of all, regular coalition governments might make it a bit more difficult to do the kind of unilateral structural changes which have been the norm for the last generation. We'll see. Some political scientists, as you know, think that we're likely to get coalitions fairly regularly in future. Others don't think that at all. So we'll have to wait and see. But that could blunt it. Growing public cynicism might reduce the symbolic short-term games of announcing yet another reform. They might. I'm sort of a little bit doubtful about that mechanism myself, because I think on the whole it washes over the public, even if they see any information about it at all. It's not headlines in the Sun. It doesn't normally get on the television news, or if it does, it's not the first item. And I guess most people have been taking it with a pinch of salt for quite a long time anyway. The white papers, anyway, are directed at Parliament, but Parliament has no role in this process. It's a very strange sort of process. The whole process is bizarre to me. Governments could pass some kind of self-denying ordinance. They could say, okay, in future we will only change the machinery of government, only change departments or introduce major management reforms in statutory form. Or we will never do it without introducing a costing, like you have on any other kind of bill. How much will this cost? And without specifying targets and without having it audited each year for the next 5 years by the national audit. They could do something like that. I see no sign of them doing it. It would be a rather unusual piece of government action to make things more difficult for themselves without there being a strong reason for it. So on the whole, my hunch, it's no more than that, is that in the near future the probability of major change in this particular area of central government management reform is quite low. The current situation, the situation which has been going on more or less for 4 decades, it seems to me is likely to go on for a little bit longer. And so finally, it's not much of a joke, but I'll say it anyway. Promises continue to be plentiful, even if they're not cheap. Thank you.